I never imagined that the worst night of my life would become the greatest triumph of my existence. When I met Daniel, I knew our relationship wouldn't be easy. He was a sweet, kind, and well-mannered man, but his mother was a nightmare in human form. Mrs. Martha never bothered to hide her disdain for me. From the very beginning, she treated me like an opportunist, someone beneath her family's standards. "Sarah, dear, don't you think Daniel deserves someone better?" she would say, flashing a fake smile and eyes as sharp as a knife. I ignored it, pretended not to care, but her words gnawed at my patience. And after the wedding, avoiding her became impossible. When Daniel had to travel for work for 2 weeks, Martha insisted that I stay at her house. "So you won't be alone," she said. But it wasn't an invitation. It was a test. And I failed. On the very first night, Martha made it clear that I wasn't welcome. The guest room? Under renovation. The couch? My back can't handle someone sprawling all over it. The only option she gave me? The basement. "If you want, you can sleep down there. It's spacious and dark. But I'm sure you'll get used to it." I swallowed hard, feeling my dignity slip away with every step I took down the stairs. The basement smelled of mold and dust, a stark contrast to the luxury of Martha's extravagant home. My pillow? An old cushion. My blanket? A forgotten coat. Lying there in the cold, I made myself a promise: she would regret every second of this. The basement was cramped, damp, and filled with relics of a forgotten past. Boxes stacked against the concrete walls, the scent of rotting wood, and a silence so heavy that my own heartbeat felt deafening. Lying on the cold floor, I hugged the coat tighter and closed my eyes, trying to block out the humiliation Martha had put me through. She wanted me to know my place in that house. But what she didn't know was that the house was mine. Daniel never told his mother that he wasn't actually the owner of the mansion. He only lived there out of convenience, because I had bought that house years before, long before I even met him. When we got married, he stayed because he liked the neighborhood and the structure. But Martha, with her unshakable arrogance, assumed he was the one supporting everything. I could have told her. I could have thrown the truth right in her face. But I chose to wait for the perfect moment. And now, I had the perfect opportunity. The next morning, I climbed the stairs, my eyes burning from exhaustion. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as Martha, as flawless as ever, sat at the breakfast table flipping through a home decor magazine. "Oh, you're up. I hope you slept well in the basement." She didn't even look at me. I took a deep breath, ignoring the tightness in my chest. If she wanted a war, she would get one. Yes, an unforgettable experience. I smiled, taking a seat at the table. Martha shot me a suspicious glance, expecting me to snap. But I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. "Good to know. I'll have the maid move your things down there, then. That way, you won't have to bother anymore." Oh, she really thought she was winning. The next few days were torture. Martha never missed a chance to make me feel like a stranger in my own home. She hosted dinners without inviting me, gossiped with her friends about how I wasn't good enough for Daniel, and even went as far as hiding some of my clothes just to make me look like a fool searching for them. But I held my ground. After all, my plan was already in motion. On the 5th day, I decided it was time to put my revenge into action. Martha was so comfortable playing queen of the house that she didn't realize everything could come crashing down at any moment. One evening, as she prepared to host a dinner for the ladies of high society, I walked into the kitchen and found the maid, Mrs. Lucia, sweating over the extravagant dishes that Martha had demanded. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, grabbing a cutting board. Mrs. Lucia's eyes widened in surprise. No one in the family had ever offered to help her. But I wasn't Martha. "Oh, ma'am, Mrs. Martha wouldn't like to see you in the kitchen." "Well, Mrs. Lucia, I'm the real owner of this house." Her eyes widened even more. "What?" "Exactly what you heard," I smiled, slicing a piece of bread. "And soon, Martha will find that out the hard way." That night, as Martha strutted around her wealthy friends, showing off her expensive dress and fake smile, I made a point to sit at the head of the table. She frowned. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed through clenched teeth. "Getting comfortable. After all, this house is mine, isn't it?" Martha let out a sarcastic laugh, and her friends exchanged curious glances. Sweetheart, the only thing that's yours here is that dreadful basement. Funny. I swirled the wine in my glass. I could have sworn my name is on the deed to this house. Silence. Absolute silence. Martha blinked, as if she had misheard. Don't joke about this, Sarah. I'm not joking. I pulled out my phone, opened the scanned document, zoomed in, and turned the screen toward her. The title read, Property of Sarah Almeida. The color drained from her face in seconds. Her friends began whispering among themselves. This can't be true. Martha stammered. Oh, but it is. I crossed my legs and took a slow sip of wine. And you know what's even more interesting? I let you humiliate me for days, just to see how far your arrogance would go. The room was in complete shock. Martha opened and closed her mouth like a fish, gasping for air. Daniel never mentioned this. Because he didn't think it was relevant. But now that you know. I stood up slowly, placing my hands on the table. I think we should discuss new living arrangements, don't you? Panic spread across her face. And at that moment, I savored my victory. Martha looked like she had lost all sense of reality. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for support among her friends, but all she found were uncomfortable expressions. None of them wanted to be associated with the humiliation she was going through. You must be joking. Her voice came out weak, almost a whisper. Joking? I smirked, leaning slightly over the table. I spent nights sleeping in that disgusting basement because you treated me like garbage. You made me feel like an unwanted guest in my own home. Her eyes burned with anger, but there was something else there, too, fear. I didn't know, she protested. If I had known. Oh, but you never cared to know, did you? I crossed my arms. You just assumed that because I was married to your son, I was nothing more than an insignificant outsider. My words hit her like a well-aimed strike. Martha, the woman who thought she owned everything, had been reduced to nothing in mere minutes. Mrs. Lucia, who had been watching silently until then, finally cleared her throat and said softly, Well, Mrs. Martha, perhaps now we should reconsider where everyone sleeps in this house. A few chuckles rippled through the table. Martha turned as red as a tomato. She knew. Everyone knew. In that moment, I no longer saw the arrogant, overbearing woman who had tormented me for so long, but a small, pathetic figure clinging to a status that was never truly hers. And I wasn't done yet. Martha remained frozen, her eyes locked on the document displayed on my phone. Her world was crumbling right before her eyes, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something I never expected, weakness. Her friends began gathering their things, muttering rushed goodbyes as they grabbed their coats. None of them wanted to be there when the bomb fully went off. Ladies, wait. Martha called after them, but they barely glanced back. The Queen of Pride was being abandoned by her own court. When the door finally closed, only the two of us remained, me, standing with my arms crossed, and her, sitting there with trembling hands. You knew all along, she murmured, still too afraid to look me in the eye. Always. Martha squeezed her eyes shut and massaged her temples. Was this a trap? No. I smiled. It was a test. Just like the one you gave me. She swallowed hard. And guess what? I continued. You failed. A heavy silence settled between us. Martha took a deep breath and finally met my gaze. For the first time, I didn't see disdain in her eyes. She studied me carefully, and a long sigh escaped her lips. You won, didn't you? My smile widened. I've always won, Martha. You just never realized it until now. She closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing everything, and then did something I never expected. She laughed. Softly, almost a whisper. But she laughed. You're smarter than I thought. And you're blinder than you imagined. Martha ran her hands over her face, took a deep breath, and stood up. So, what happens now? She asked, her voice laced with resignation. I crossed my arms and held her gaze, letting the weight of her question settle between us. That depends on you. And at that moment, the game changed forever. Martha stood there, waiting for my answer. For the first time, she wasn't in control. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. She knew I could throw her out of the house right then and there. And by the way her lips pressed together, I could tell this was the first time she had ever truly felt vulnerable. "Well," she repeated, her voice less firm than before. "What do you want me to do?" I crossed my arms and tilted my head, studying her the way she had always studied me. I could have taken my revenge in the cruelest way possible. I could have ordered her to pack her things and leave this house forever. I could have made her feel the same kind of rejection she had inflicted on me. But suddenly, I realized something. I didn't need to. Martha was already defeated. Not by me, but by herself. The weight of humiliation, the judgmental looks from her friends, the shock of discovering that everything she believed was a lie, nothing I could say or do would be worse than the internal collapse she was already experiencing. The worst revenge had already happened. I sighed and took a step forward. "What happens next, Martha, is entirely up to you." She frowned. "If you want to keep living here, you'll have to treat me with respect. As the owner of this house. As your son's wife." She stayed quiet. I knew this wouldn't be easy for her. But I was done being treated as inferior. "And if I don't agree," she murmured. "Then the door is right there." She held my gaze for a long moment. Her mouth opened as if she were about to lash out, to insult, to fight back, but nothing came. No words. No defiance. Just silence. Martha had always thought of herself as a powerful woman. She believed no one could ever bring her down. But now, faced with the undeniable truth, she realized the game was over. Finally, she sighed, looking 10 years older. "All right." Her voice was barely a whisper. "You win." I smiled softly. "This isn't about winning, Martha." She let out a humorless laugh. "Of course it isn't. But tell me, did Daniel know about this?" I blinked slowly, keeping my expression unreadable. "No." She raised an eyebrow. "So your own husband didn't know he was living in his wife's house?" I stepped closer, face to face with her. "He didn't care." She tilted her head, studying me. And for the first time, I saw something different in her eyes. Respect. And in that moment, I knew our relationship would never be the same. In the days that followed, the house felt different. Martha no longer looked at me with her usual disdain, but with a mix of caution and curiosity. She was trying to understand the woman I was, the one she had underestimated for so long. And I, too, began to see Martha differently. I had spent so much time hating her, wanting to see her humiliated, that I had never stopped to think about what would happen next. Now that the truth was out, a new dynamic was taking shape between us. But something was still unresolved. Daniel returned from his trip 2 days later. He walked into the house, smiling, ready to embrace me, only to stop in his tracks when he felt the tension in the air. "What happened here?" Daniel asked, frowning. Before I could answer, surprisingly, Martha stepped forward. "We had a necessary conversation." Daniel looked between me and his mother, clearly confused. "Right, and this conversation involved what, exactly?" I took a deep breath. "It involved the fact that your mother thought this house was yours when, in reality, it's mine." Daniel blinked. "Wait, what?" Martha lowered her head, and for the first time in her life, she looked embarrassed. I met my husband's gaze and repeated, slowly. "The house you've lived in your entire life. The house where your mother made me sleep in the basement. It's mine." Silence. Heavy silence. Daniel looked at Martha, then back at me, and let out a stunned laugh. "Wait, you knew about this, Mom?" She took a deep breath before answering. "No. But now I do." Daniel crossed his arms and looked at me, a mix of surprise and admiration in his eyes. "And you waited until now to tell me?" I smirked. "I thought it would be more interesting this way." He chuckled and shook his head. "You really know how to pull off a masterstroke, huh?" Martha remained silent, but something in her posture shifted. Maybe, deep down, she had finally learned her lesson. But there was still one last move left to play. Daniel was still processing the revelation when, unexpectedly, Martha stood up and walked over to the window. Her hands were clasped behind her back, and for a moment, she remained silent, as if reflecting on everything. Then, without turning around, she said, "I made a mistake." Both Daniel and I exchanged surprised glances. Martha never admitted to mistakes. She took a deep, steadying breath and continued. I spent so much time convincing myself that Sarah was an outsider that I failed to see the obvious. The problem was never her. My heart pounded. I had expected many reactions from Martha: denial, anger, coldness, but I had not expected such a direct acknowledgement. The problem was me. Daniel frowned. Mom. No. She raised a hand, signaling for silence. I've always prided myself on being a strong woman. I always thought I knew everything, that I was always right. But the truth is, I became bitter. She finally turned to face me, and for the first time, her eyes were filled with something I never expected to see: regret. Sarah, I was cruel to you. I remained silent, letting her speak. When I found out Daniel was getting married, I felt like I was losing my son. And when I saw you, young, beautiful, independent, I felt jealous. Daniel's eyes widened. Jealous? Martha let out a humorless chuckle. Yes. You didn't need my son for anything. You didn't need my approval. You were free from all the things that had trapped me my whole life. And that enraged me. I swallowed hard. I had never seen it that way. I had always assumed Martha hated me because she thought I was unworthy of her son. But now, looking at her, vulnerable, I realized the truth was far more complicated. But none of that excuses what I did, she continued. I treated you like a stranger in your own home. I humiliated you. I made you sleep in the basement when I should have welcomed you with open arms. She took a deep breath and met my eyes. And for that, I apologize. The silence in the room was absolute. Daniel looked at me, waiting for my reaction. I had everything I wanted: Martha humiliated, Martha remorseful. But strangely enough, I didn't feel satisfied. Because, in the end, my revenge had never been about destroying her. It had been about making her see me for who I truly was. And now, finally, she did. I took a deep breath and, after a long moment, reached out my hand to her. Martha hesitated. But then, slowly, she took my hand. And in that moment, the war between us ended. I held Martha's hand for a few seconds, feeling the tension dissolve in the air. We weren't friends. We weren't close. But in that moment, we finally understood each other. Daniel, still stunned, ran a hand through his hair. That was unexpected. I let out a short laugh. For me too. Martha took a step back, looking lighter than before. Her face still bore the marks of the humiliation she had endured that night, but there was also something new there: humility. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. But I'd like to try to change. To try to be someone better for you, and for Daniel. The shock in Daniel's eyes was undeniable. Mom, are you really saying this? She sighed. Yes, son. It's time for me to grow up. I crossed my arms and looked at her with a small smile. Well, Martha, I'm not a resentful woman. And since this house is mine, I think I can give you a second chance. She let out a genuine, slightly ironic laugh. That sounds fair. We held each other's gaze for a long moment, and in that instant, I knew something had changed forever. I had entered that house as an outsider. But now, I was the one setting the rules. And Martha finally knew it. The next morning, when I came downstairs for breakfast, I found Martha already sitting at the table, sipping her tea. She looked up as I walked in and, to my surprise, smiled. Good morning, Sarah. It was the first time she had said my name without venom in her voice. I smiled back and poured myself some coffee. Daniel walked in shortly after, watching us as if we were about to break into another war. But when he noticed the peaceful atmosphere between us, he relaxed. Looks like something's changed around here, he commented, grabbing a piece of toast. Martha took a deep breath and said, I think it's time I started acting like an adult. Daniel and I exchanged amused glances. About the basement, Martha began, fidgeting with the ring on her finger. I raised an eyebrow, waiting. She cleared her throat and looked at me, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Let's just say, if you'd like, I can arrange a more suitable room for you. Daniel's laughter echoed through the kitchen, and I smiled, lifting my cup. I appreciate it, Martha, I teased. But I think I'd rather keep the master suite. She chuckled, shaking her head. And for the first time, we had breakfast together like a real family.